We met for the first time, and when he put on that fedora and he strung on that whip, he gave shape and attitude and style and vulnerability. I owe Harrison a great personal debt.
He has directed more box office history than anyone alive, and yet the thing that seems to matter most to Steven Spielberg isn't the record-breaking numbers. It's the handful of actors he keeps returning to, decade after decade, film after film. Some of them he has directed 4 times. One of them he only worked with once, and still calls him a friend he thinks about to this day. Another spent a year building a voice from scratch and left Spielberg speechless on set. By the end of this video you'll understand something most people never notice about the most successful director in history. He isn't just choosing performers, he's choosing people he trusts with the most vulnerable moments of his films, and the stories behind those choices are stranger and more human than you'd expect. Let's start with the actor everybody thinks of first. Harrison Ford and Steven Spielberg made 4 films together across nearly 30 years, beginning with Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981 and carrying through to Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull in 2008. That alone puts Ford near the center of Spielberg's entire career. But if you want to understand why the two of them clicked so completely, you have to go back to a miserable stretch of desert in Tunisia, where the crew was standing in for Cairo, Egypt, and the shoot had turned into an endurance test. Temperatures were regularly climbing past 100 degrees, and a wave of dysentery tore through much of the production. Spielberg avoided it by bringing his own food and water from England, a level of caution Ford later joked about, saying the director practically sealed himself off from a local food and drink for the entire trip. Ford wasn't as lucky. He was sick for days, weak, and barely able to leave his trailer for more than the length of a single camera roll. That timing became a problem, because the script called for an elaborate 3.5-page fight between Indiana Jones and a black-robed swordsman, a full-blown whip versus blade duel that had been planned for months and rehearsed with a specially trained stunt performer named Terry Richards. It would have taken 2 to 3 more days to shoot, days the exhausted, dysentery-stricken production could not really spare. On the ride out to the location, Ford turned the idea over in his head, and by the time he reached Spielberg, he had made up his mind. He suggested that instead of fighting the swordsman, Indy should simply pull out his revolver and shoot him. Spielberg didn't hesitate. He told Ford he had been thinking the exact same thing. So they shot it that way. The swordsman shows off his skill with an elaborate flourish, and Indy responds with a tired, unimpressed look before calmly shooting him dead. It became one of the biggest laughs in the film, a moment now considered one of the most iconic beats in adventure movie history, and it was born entirely out of illness, heat, and 2 men reading each other's minds without saying much at all. That kind of shorthand became the foundation of their whole partnership. Spielberg trusted Ford enough to let him rewrite pivotal scenes on the spot, and that trust ran so deep that when Jurassic Park came together, Spielberg wanted Ford for the lead role of Dr. Alan Grant. Ford turned it down. Spielberg has said publicly that he wasn't just disappointed, he was genuinely let down by it, which tells you how much weight he placed on having Ford in his corner. When Harrison Ford walks into a Spielberg frame, audiences believe instantly that they're watching someone capable, someone in control, and that kind of built-in credibility is worth more to a director than almost anything else an actor can offer. It's worth sitting with that Jurassic Park detail for a moment, because it says something about how Spielberg operates. He doesn't just want good actors. He wants actors whose presence he already understands, whose rhythms he can plan a film around before a single frame is shot. Losing Ford for that role wasn't just a casting inconvenience, it was the loss of a shorthand that had taken years to build. Spielberg eventually cast Sam Neill instead, and the film became one of the biggest hits of all time regardless, but the fact that Spielberg still brings up wanting Ford tells you how rare that particular kind of trust is, even for a director who has worked with nearly every major star of his generation. Now go back further, before Indiana Jones ever existed, to the actor who might be the most personal of all of Spielberg's collaborators, Richard Dreyfuss. Their relationship was forged during one of the most notoriously difficult shoots in Hollywood history, the 1975 production of Jaws. The mechanical shark, nicknamed Bruce by the crew, had been tested in fresh water and essentially fell apart once it hit the corrosive salt water of the ocean. Dreyfuss later described a production where the shark simply didn't work for long stretches at a time, forcing constant delays while crew members radioed back and forth trying to get the thing functioning again. A shoot that was budgeted for around 55 days stretched out to well over 150. Spielberg has said he genuinely believed his directing career might be over because of how far over schedule and over budget the film had gone. In the middle of that chaos was Dreyfuss, playing the young, motor-mouthed oceanographer Matt Hooper. He had nearly passed on the role, and only fought to get it after watching an earlier performance of his own and panicking that his career needed a serious win. Spielberg reshaped the character to fit him, and the two came out of that grueling, sinking production as close creative partners. So when Spielberg's next deeply personal project came together, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he wanted Dreyfuss again, even though the role of Roy Neary had drawn interest from major stars of the era. Dreyfuss pushed hard for the part, and Spielberg has openly credited him with talking his way into the role. What makes this pairing stand out isn't just the persistence, though. It's what Spielberg has said the casting actually meant to him. He has described putting Dreyfuss in the role of Roy Neary, the ordinary suburban father who becomes consumed with wonder and obsession over something beyond his understanding, as a way of putting a version of himself on screen. Dreyfuss has pushed back a little on that framing over the years, noting that he's very much his own person and not simply a stand-in for anyone. But he has also acknowledged the closeness of the bond, and the way that particular sense of childlike wonder connected them. It's a rare thing for a filmmaker to admit that an actor became an extension of his own personality, and it says a lot about how much Spielberg valued Dreyfuss's willingness to be vulnerable and a little ridiculous on screen, chasing something he couldn't fully explain. Think about what that really means for a working relationship. Most directors keep a professional distance from their actors, even the ones they like. Spielberg did the opposite with Dreyfuss. He handed him the parts of himself that were hardest to dramatize, the wide-eyed obsession, the refusal to let go of something everyone else thought was crazy, and trusted him to carry it without turning it into a joke. That's not a casting decision most directors make twice. Spielberg made it twice in a row, first with the traumatized shark hunter's foil in Jaws and then with the suburban dreamer in Close Encounters. And both times it paid off in performances that still hold up as some of the most sincere work of the 1970s. From there, jump ahead to 2012 and a very different kind of trust, one built not on decades of history but on a single extraordinarily demanding performance. Spielberg wanted Daniel Day-Lewis to play Abraham Lincoln, and it took him almost a decade to get a yes. He first approached Day-Lewis back in 2003, and the actor turned it down, apparently uneasy with the idea of stepping into such a towering historical figure. For a long stretch after that, Liam Neeson was attached to the role, until enough time passed that Neeson felt he had aged past playing Lincoln convincingly and stepped aside, reportedly urging Spielberg directly to go after Day-Lewis instead. When Spielberg returned to him with a script narrowed down to focus only on the final months of Lincoln's life, centered on the fight to pass the 13th Amendment, Day-Lewis finally agreed, on the condition that he would get a long runway to prepare. What followed became one of the most talked-about preparation processes in modern film history. He immersed himself in books about Lincoln, starting with Doris Kearns Goodwin's team of Rivals, the text the film was partly based on, and he has said he could have kept reading for another 15 years and still not exhausted the material. He worked to find Lincoln's voice almost by instinct, listening for it internally until it felt authentic, eventually landing on a softer, higher, more conversational tone than the booming voice many people assume a 19th-century statesman must have had. When he felt ready, Day-Lewis recorded that voice and sent it to Spielberg in an envelope marked for his eyes only, with a hand-drawn skull and crossbones on it as a warning to keep it private. Spielberg has said that when he finally played the tape, it didn't feel like listening to an actor doing an impression. It felt like Lincoln himself was speaking to him. On set, the immersion continued. By arrangement with Spielberg, the cast and crew referred to Day-Lewis only as Mr. President throughout the shoot, and English cast members were asked to avoid using their natural accents around him so as not to break the spell he had built. Sally Field, who played Mary Todd Lincoln, has said Day-Lewis texted her in character for months leading up to filming, and she had to respond in the language and rhythms of the era just to keep up. Then there's the moment that seems to define the entire collaboration. During a scene where Lincoln delivers a passionate speech to his cabinet arguing for the amendment's urgency, Day-Lewis performed it in long, unbroken takes, and Spielberg was reportedly so moved and overwhelmed by what he was witnessing that he had to step away from the set entirely. Day-Lewis went on to win his third Best Actor Oscar for the role, becoming the first actor to win 3 Best Actor Academy Awards, and the first to win one for a Spielberg film. For a director who has worked with some of the biggest names in the industry, that kind of total transformation, built almost entirely on trust and private preparation, clearly left a mark on him. There's also something worth noting about how unusual this collaboration was for Spielberg specifically. He's a filmmaker known for keeping a fairly tight, efficient set, someone who plans his shots meticulously and moves fast once cameras roll. Handing that much control over to an actor's process, agreeing to a full year of preparation, allowing an entire cast and crew to reorganize their language around one performer, is not something Spielberg has done for anyone else on this list. It suggests that when he recognized a level of commitment that matched his own obsessive attention to detail, he was willing to bend his own habits completely out of shape to make room for it. If Day-Lewis represents the most intense, once-in-a-career kind of collaboration, Tom Hanks represents the opposite: steady, repeated, decades-long partnership. The two have made 5 feature films together, including Saving Private Ryan, Catch Me If You Can, The Terminal, Bridge of Spies, and The Post, along with a string of acclaimed war television projects they produced together, among them Band of Brothers, The Pacific, and Masters of the Air. Nobody has been a more constant presence across the back half of Spielberg's career than Hanks. What's interesting is that Hanks wasn't eager to work with Spielberg at first. By his own account, he'd seen friendships in Hollywood get wrecked by bad filmmaking experiences, and he didn't want to risk that with someone he admired. He did it anyway, and Saving Private Ryan became the proving ground for their partnership in a very literal sense. Wanting his cast to feel like real soldiers rather than actors playing dress-up, Spielberg sent the principal cast through a brutal, week-long boot camp in the English countryside, overseen by a former U.S. Marine Corps captain and military advisor named Dale Dye. The conditions were rough: constant rain, freezing temperatures, heavy packs, barely any sleep, and every actor was referred to not by name but by a number. Hanks, the biggest star in the group, was designated turd number 1. 3 days into the ordeal, morale collapsed. The cast, exhausted and soaked to the bone, took a vote on whether to walk away from the training entirely. By most accounts, nearly the whole group wanted out, with Hanks as the lone holdout. According to Dale Dye, Hanks made a call to Spielberg to flag the situation, and ultimately it was Hanks himself who convinced the rest of the cast to see it through, arguing that they owed it to the real soldiers they were portraying to push through the discomfort. Vin Diesel, who was part of that cast, later said he was struck by the fact that a star of Hanks's stature, someone who didn't need to be there at all, was the one voting to stay and suffer alongside everyone else. That week became the emotional glue of the entire production, and it's exactly the kind of quiet leadership Spielberg has praised in him ever since. When Spielberg talks about what makes Hanks so essential to his work, he tends to reach for comparisons to classic Hollywood's most beloved leading men, describing him as carrying the same kind of everyman decency that once defined stars like James Stewart. It's the highest compliment Spielberg tends to give, and it explains why, film after film, he keeps handing Hanks roles built around quiet integrity under pressure. What makes the Hanks partnership different from everything else on this list is its sheer durability. Ford gave Spielberg a handful of adventures spread across decades. Day-Lewis gave him one transformative performance. Hanks gave him a working relationship that has stretched across war epics, prison dramas, courtroom thrillers, and airport comedies, and somehow never seemed to run out of new ground to cover. Producing Band of Brothers, The Pacific, and Masters of the Air together took that partnership well beyond acting and directing into a shared obsession with telling stories about ordinary people under extraordinary pressure, which might be the closest thing Spielberg has to a career-long creative mission statement.